It's time not only to change the narrative, but start telling the truth. It's time for kids to know, all kids of all kinds, and grown-ups to know, of all kinds, that Black history didn't start with slavery. If you haven't introduced your students to Anthony Browder's Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization, you haven't done your students a fair job. If you haven't introduced your students to the book Stop Falling for the Okie Doke, you haven't done your students a fair job. It's time for these kids to hear from Robert Wald Sussman's book, which is The Myth of Race, that this whole thing is a myth. And it's time to stop believing the myth. And it's time to stop teaching the myth. And it's time to realize that blacks were doing cataract surgery with metal instruments before there were hospitals in Europe. It's time to realize that blacks were intelligent, creative, adventurous, curious, brilliant people.
Hello guys, welcome once again to the channel. I hope wherever you're watching, you're having a great time. Now, one question that many people have been asking about the existence of blacks in America is the fact that how do they stomach knowing they have been subjected through a lot of disenfranchisement, and still even to date the government doesn't even want to look at those atrocities committed against black people and consider them as wrongs that were ever done. In fact, if you talk about questions like reparations and anything, there are people who are not ready to listen to any talk of reparation being paid to black people because they think that either blacks are lazy or they have not been involved directly in the performance or even in conducting such kind of atrocities against black people, and therefore they don't need to have their taxpayers' money paid to a group of people who are wronged by ancestors years and years back. But then we also have to talk about how these kind of disenfranchisements that have always been happening towards black people, they have a compounding effect and they spiral down to new generations forever. For example, if you look at the situation where after people came from the Vietnam War, white veterans were given land. But what happened to black people who are in this war? They got nothing. We know how redlining worked. Black people have been denied the ability to own home. Black people have been denied the chance for direct home ownership, which we know that in the United States, this is one of the steps towards having some wealth creation strategy that you can never have. So this is something that whites are wondering. How are blacks surviving in America? And how is it living as a black person, especially as a black child, being told about your history, being taught how America is so much against you that even becoming the greatest thing you want to be has a lot of hurdles placed in your way towards this journey that you want to achieve. How are black people coping? How are they living these experiences? So he came out and spoke about how blacks feel, and creators from different platforms spoke about this, and they gave a varied level of responses that are quite interesting. So I've compiled these videos that I want you to watch. Take a listen to what they have to say about how being a black person in the United States is nothing easy. Let's watch this. I shall come back in the end with my commentaries.
So I just finished watching this video of this woman making food for Thanksgiving, and she was talking about the history of Black Americans and Thanksgiving. And she was talking about how Thanksgiving was one of the first holidays that people who were enslaved were allowed to celebrate. And like many Americans, specifically white Americans who learned about slavery, I'm realizing that my education around the entire topic and history is so skewed and flawed. And the amount of things that I've learned just by following black creators on TikTok is more than I've ever learned in school. So then I started thinking about the conversations that I had with my parents about slavery when I started learning about it in school. And then it got me thinking, how do black parents have the conversation about slavery with their children? Is it a conversation that's like you sit down and you lay everything out? Is it like something that you slowly reveal more information about because it's obviously a very traumatic topic? Or for anybody out there, was it something that your parents even talked to you about? Or was it something that was like, oh, learned it in school? This is a 100% genuine question, and I just want to learn the differences of how black families teach about slavery versus white families. Genuine question, and I just want to learn the differences of how black families teach about slavery versus white families.
I can't actually remember a time when my parents didn't teach me about slavery. It was ingrained in me from the time that I was a very little girl, and they did so by teaching me about the humanity of our ancestors in addition to their enslavement. My mother taught us by teaching us the music of our ancestors. So by the time I was 5 years old, I was in churches in South Carolina singing Kumbaya as a soloist. My father told us lots of amazing stories about our ancestors, again, not centering the enslavers, but talking about the humanity of the enslaved ancestors. So he actually knew the names of the families that had enslaved us and the places that we were enslaved. This is a picture of the Milford Plantation in Pinewood, South Carolina. I'd heard about this place almost my whole life because I had an ancestor named Scipio Rames who had been enslaved here. I visited in 2019 when I took this picture because I wanted to see the house that was built by the hands of my family. Once Scipio was emancipated, he was one of the first African-American men to register to vote in this county. So my family taught us that this system of slavery was a god-awful thing that was put upon our family, but it didn't define us because we were survivors, and that gives me a tremendous sense of pride.
Openly and proudly black. The conversation about racism is always happening. It's when the children start to notice that you're talking about racism and they come to you with questions that you actually start the conversations, because there's never a starting point. And we don't start with slavery. We start with racism. Right? You might hear your grandmother huffing and puffing, frustrated about something that she watched on the news. You might see your dad grumbling about the fact that this black man didn't get elected, and you start to be curious, but you're constantly putting, like children, you're constantly putting together clues. So you don't come to these conversations with like really academic questions. You come to the conversations trying to make sense of your observations in your parents' kind of culture that they've built for you. Now, when it comes to slavery, that's an academic question. Now, in a city like Atlanta, you are going to have teachers who use Black History Month to talk about people who've done things, and they'll say they were enslaved and later on they did this. You're going to have plays and presentations, and so the children are going to constantly hear that. But when my kid came home talking about Thomas Jefferson, her teacher taught about Thomas Jefferson and all the wonderful things he did, I said, yeah, Thomas Jefferson did a lot of things as a politician, but he was ultimately a bad guy. And she said, why? And I said, because Thomas Jefferson had a farm, a really big farm, bigger than he and his family could care for, but he wanted that big farm anyway because he was super greedy. And so instead of hiring people to work that farm and giving them their money, he kidnapped people and forced them to work the farm so he could keep all the money. And if they tried to run away, he beat them. And I looked at her and I waited for her shock and and we sat and had that conversation. But the conversation about slavery tends to come later than the conversation about racism. And it's just a normal part of how we live.
To this question across TikTok, and I've loved all of them. They've come from different directions. I think they're fantastic. For me, I was raised in a household where my parents did what they could to shield us from a lot of things. They wanted to keep us safe, I feel, is what they wanted to do. So we didn't discuss slavery a lot and how our ancestors were enslaved. We watched the movie Roots and got some understanding of what that movie was about and the book and everything, but we didn't go into details about how we were brought over here, how we were kidnapped and brought over here, and everything that went into being enslaved. A lot of what I know, most of what I know, has been from learning myself or from other people that have historical knowledge that I've been able to kind of ascertain from that, and then using that as a jumping off point to understand what slavery was then and how it's still perpetuated here today. I think some of it might also be generational. You know, I'm 44 years old, my mom is 72, and I think that maybe it's not generational. I don't know. The more that I think about it, I think that my parents were just trying to keep my brother and I in this mindset that it's going to get better, or it's better than what it was. All that's to say is that, for the question, how do black parents teach their children about slavery? Black parents aren't a monolith and black people aren't a monolith. But my personal experience, like I mentioned, I really didn't learn much about it at home. I came from a place of being taught respectability politics, knowing my place, knowing how to say the right things, do the right things, show up the right way, many ways to do what I believe my parents kept me safe. I'm also thinking, now that I've sparked something in my head, I'm also thinking, I don't know that not having that specific talk, I don't know if it would have shaped me in a different way. I don't know. It's our history. I'm talking completely in draft. It's our history. It absolutely is our history. It's part of who we are. It's part of who we are, and we see it every day today. It speaks to the resilience. With that being part of our history, it speaks to our resilience. It speaks to our strength. It speaks to our tenacity. All of these things which we would have had even if we weren't kidnapped and brought here and dehumanized and treated like less than human. I'm happy for this question, and oh boy, if I did not create myself some own journaling moments. Thanks for going on this ride with me.
Mine didn't. I had to learn about racism through experiencing it. So I'm a continental African, and I spent most of my life living on the continent, which means I have a certain level of privilege, right? I grew up in predominantly black spaces. Even living in South Africa, I never experienced racism. That was never a thing. It wasn't until I moved to Switzerland. Mind you, this is a whole other country. I don't speak the language. I was 8 years old. On my first day of school, I was the only black person in my class. The first day of school, somebody says the N-word to me. I don't know what that is. I asked the teacher what that means. She's like, who said that to you? Oh, this kid said it to me. She sat me down. My teacher's white. My teacher sat me down and explained. I don't know why she was explaining this to an 8-year-old, but she explained it to me, and I was still confused because I was 8. I couldn't compute it. So I go back home to my parents and I tell them what happened, and the conversation was just never had. I just grew up in a world that was inherently racist, and I had to learn with the experiences. So I'm one of those kids whose parents never said anything about it.
We don't talk about slavery. We're more apt to talk about civil rights with our children than we are slavery, and that's two different things. I don't think any of us have the capacity to even be able to begin to discuss with our children what it was like to be a slave. But we can talk about the violation of our rights after we're supposed to be free, because it's still happening today. There is no secret why black kids don't play with their black mamas and daddies. There was no need for me to have the conversation with my children that back in slavery times, parents used to beat the crap out of their kids because they had to teach them how to act, because at least after that beating, they would come back alive. There is no need for me to tell my children that if those same children didn't act right, a lot of times they would lose their lives to their slave masters. What's even more disheartening, though, is I can tell my child to this day, I can never put my hands on you. I can be that gentle parent or whatever it is that it's supposed to be. And if you do exactly what you're supposed to do when you go out into the economy, you're going to be treated fairly and nobody is going to do anything to you. But that's not true. See, the conversations that I have to have with my black kids is that they need to go out into the world and they need to always be on guard and always be on their best behavior. But even then, you might run up on the wrong cop one day that you barely say something sideways to, and you can still lose your life. I've got to have conversations with my kids that even if you go out to go get a coffee and somebody don't like you because of the color of your skin, you've got to keep all that anger and all of that emotion that you feel bottled up on the inside because you don't want it to become a problem. I can't talk to my kids about slavery because reality is I'm too busy preparing them for their future.
So in our house, we talked about it slowly, kind of a build to this history. In a lot of households, I think we are trying to emotionally protect our children because we know the world will not protect them when it comes time to have these conversations in school. If you are the lone black kid, when the topic comes up in a classroom, everyone turns to look at you. If you have the wrong kind of history teacher, they're going to try and argue with you that slavery wasn't that bad. And because I have a degree in history and my husband and I both come from families where the person who was enslaved was our grandparents' grandparent, or in one case, grandparents' parent, we are having the kind of conversations you have where slavery is not abstract. Slavery is a very real part of family history. But we also had to prepare our kids for the reality that in school, depending upon teacher, classroom, all of these things, they might hear some things that they would know were not necessarily accurate. And they would need to be able to disagree respectfully. It was not a comfortable experience, right? It was not terrible. My kids were raised in Chicago. They went to schools that were predominantly black, so it was easier. But I definitely know people who went to majority white schools who had teachers that were very slavery denialists, shall we say. That's why we have those news stories, it seems like every year, where someone decides to hold a fake slave auction or decides to have children write about the economic benefits of slavery. It's not by accident. It is a way of undermining the truth of America's history. So you have to build in the wall against the lie, if that makes sense. Hope that answered your question.
So I'm a millennial, born in the 80s, the late 80s. And the way that I learned about slavery was through conversations with my grandmother, who was actually born on a slave plantation. My grandmother is still alive. She's in her mid 80s. She just retired about 3 years ago from working. She worked on a slave plantation up until she was 16 years old. She was born on a slave plantation. Her father was born on a slave plantation. He was a sharecropper. His family was born on a slave plantation. You can literally go to that same slave plantation in Louisiana right now, and you can see the big house, you can see the slave quarters, you can see all that. You can see the very land that my grandparents, my grandmother and her family all worked on. You can see this. In addition to having these conversations about my grandmother's childhood, back when we were growing up, television networks were not shy about talking about slavery in America. Like Disney used to have specials on it regularly. Like there was a show called Night John. I'm sorry, it was a movie. And that was one aspect. When we went to school, we had plays that talk about the Underground Railroad in complete context. And I remember this song in elementary school that they used to teach us called Follow the Drinking Gourd. We also had shows like Reading Rainbow that allowed us to learn about our history through storytelling. And so because of these shows, we were able to ask questions of our parents and our grandparents. Now, that same experience is very different for children today, and it will be very different for my children because a few years ago, they stopped playing Saturday morning cartoons. Shows are not going there the way that they used to on Disney and Nickelodeon. Like there was like full on shows like you would not believe. Like right now you think book banning is something that is hindering us from learning. The way that writers used to really talk about slavery in a way that a child could digest the concept of slavery at its very basic level was very prevalent when we were growing up in the 90s. But our kids don't have that now. So now they learn through TikTok, they learn through Instagram. If they're lucky, they'll be able to find a show. Like I know that the Proud Family does certain episodes where they'll go there about Black history and Kwanzaa and so many other things, but you got to have a subscription to Disney Plus. I know that PBS still does some documentaries, but I don't know about children's shows. I haven't seen that information on Disney and Nickelodeon and Nick Jr. the way that we used to see it. I'd say when it hit the 2010s, things became very different. You literally have to go digging for this information to get it taught to you at a child level. But back to the conversation of how do we discuss slavery? I have textbooks, I have picture books. When my children are old enough, we'll start having conversations about our family history. I will be able to take them to the plantation that my grandmother, their great grandmother, was born on, and we will have conversations. They can still talk to their great grandmother today, and they can literally learn from her today. They also have great aunts. My great aunts are alive, the ones that are older than my grandmother. If they are able to discuss their experiences, because it is a traumatic experience, they will be able to talk to my children. So, in summation, the way that we learn about slavery in our household is through storytelling. And we will continue to tell those stories.
You know, I'll be happy to answer your question, but before I do, I would like to know, what are you doing with this information? I have seen some Black content creators respond to your question, stitching videos, giving extraordinarily heartfelt and genuine answers. So what are you doing with our heartfelt, genuine history? This is our history that we're sharing with you, and we're not your like sociology project. We're not here to be the cure for your fucking curiosity. So what are you doing with our history? Because the answers that you're getting can be extraordinarily helpful in anti-racism spaces. But are you using this information to promote anti-racism? Are you using this information to improve the quality of our Black lives? Because if we're just answering this question because you're fucking curious, no thank you. And I want a fucking response from you, because there's a whole lot of my people that have given you answers. So you give us an answer. What are you doing with this information? Mr. I'm going viral on Black history, my history. I'm gonna wait for that answer. Y'all boost this up to make sure it gets to him. We wanna know.
How do Black parents have the conversation about slavery with their children?
This is a good ass question, and the honest answer for me is that it's a slow burn. But we pretty much tell our kids from jump the truth of what happens. But in terms of like the graphic details, the older they get, the more that they can uncover and understand. And because white supremacy is everything that we exist under, the air we breathe, everything else, we unpack it over the years, and it gets more detailed, it gets more graphic. I have a huge age gap between my kids. I have a 14-year-old and I have a 7-year-old. The conversations that I have with my 14-year-old are way more complex than what I've talked to about my 7-year-old. It also depends on where you are in your journey of decolonizing. And so because I'm fully radicalized, not only do we unpack slavery as it was then, but also how it impacts the Black community today. My kid just wrote a paper on internalized racism, detailing Christianity, homophobia, and colorism as their main talking points.
How do Black parents have the conversation about slavery with their children?
Easy. They don't. Well, I can't speak for everybody, but for me, I don't remember a time where my parents had to sit me down and explain slavery because school already did it for them. I think that's the experience for a lot of Black people. Our introduction to slavery wasn't through our parents, it was through a textbook or a lecture. Because slavery, just like the Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, have been shoved in our throats since we were in elementary school. What our parents did do was tell us that not everything that we're learning in school is the truth. And they were correct. For example, we were all taught that the first slaves arrived in America in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, omitting the fact that there were enslaved Africans here almost a century prior to that in Florida, which they don't teach us about. The Middle Passage was more than just taking a little voyage to the New World. During this time, the feeding pattern of sharks in the Atlantic Ocean was changed as they would follow slave ships knowing that they would get a meal once a slave got sick and died. I learned about that at my HBCU because most schools would rather romanticize slavery than tell the truth, which is where our parents come in.
Listening to everything that those Black creators have to say about their lived experiences and how they teach their children about the Black history in America, you get to understand that Blacks have had one hell of a lifetime in United States. It has never been easy for them. The things that they have had to do to make themselves acceptable or even live peacefully with a very, very violent and aggressive government is something that has to be studied, because how on earth can a minority be so much hated by everything but still they continue thriving? It is just a way through which I think Black people have been very resilient and they are able to address some of the major challenges that people might think are not very serious for them. they look at them with grace and they are able to overcome every challenge each and every day. So with everything that is happening, I have to appreciate the fact that regardless of the challenges and persecutions that blacks have been subjected to, they have never been willing to revenge on anybody. All they talk about is how they can empower themselves. In fact, what they always say is that blacks don't want anything from anybody. They only want a level playing field where you can't be judged by your name. We know that if you're talking about employment, black names or people with black sounding names are receiving less callbacks compared to those with white sounding names. We also know that the ability for black people to get resources to start things like businesses, it's not very easy. The level of incarceration of black people is higher as compared to their white counterparts. And therefore, if these things were supposed to be leveled so that everything seems equal for everybody, I think black people can have one of the best lives that can ever exist, because they have proven that regardless of the hurdles placed on their ways, they can still stand and continue growing strong. That, I think, is a trait that blacks across the globe have. Black American parents often begin the talk early, framing their children's lives against a backdrop of historical disenfranchisement, slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, and mass incarceration. They explain that America's promise of equality was deliberately withheld from black people for centuries. So many systems like schools, police, banks, workplace still carry that old design, even if the laws have been changed. They teach that survival and success require a dual consciousness. Master the mainstream rules while never forgetting the unwritten ones applied only to you. Children learn to distinguish between personal failures and systemic sabotage, and understanding that a traffic stop, a job interview, or a teacher's doubt can be rigged before it starts. Parents also stress pride and evidence-based hope alongside caution. They recount ancestors who voted under threat of death, built thriving communities despite exclusion, and forced the country forward through protest and excellence. This history proves resilience that works, but it also proves that the fight is intergenerational, which means it's your turn now. They give concrete scripts by keeping hands visible, speaking calmly, recording everything, excel twice as hard, build black wealth, vote every time, and never internalize the hate aimed at you. The message is love wrapped in strategy. They promise that explaining the wound is not the same as accepting it. The talk ends with a charge. Know the past, navigate the present, change the future. So your own children will never have or need a shorter, gentler version of the one you have today. I think this really sums up the kind of engagement or conversation that a black father or mother, for that matter, can have with their kid. The system has always been rigged and things don't seem good on the ground. If you look at how the American government system interacts with black kids, it's not easy, it's not normal. And I have to say that that really is what happens. And blacks have been so resilient to overcome every challenge that has been thrown to them. Share your thoughts down in the comment section. And if watching us for the first time, remember to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share. Thank you. Let's meet on the next one.